Today we're going to cover the 6 movement patterns that should go into any thorough workout training program. Let's get right into it. The 6 movement patterns are: number 1, the squat; number 2, pushing, both horizontally and vertically; number 3, pulling, both vertically and horizontally; number 4, hinging; number 5, direct core training; and then number 6 is the everything else movement of the Turkish get-up. As we go through, I'll show you some examples of each one of these so that you can make sure that you're on the same page as me with the terminology that we're using. So, a squat is using the leg muscles and the abs, the core, while going through a large range of motion at both the knee joint and the hip joint. By contrast, the hinge is using those same muscles but going through a shallow range of motion at the knee and a large range of motion at the hip. Pushing and pulling either means that we're pushing an object away from us or pushing ourselves away from an object, and we do them either horizontally or vertically. And of course, with pulling, we can pull horizontally, or we can grab something above and we can pull vertically. Usually when we're pulling horizontally, we call it rowing, just like if you were rowing on a rowboat. When we push vertically, when we push horizontally, we call both of those pressing, because we're just pressing something away from the body. The 5th movement pattern is direct core training. These muscles along the front side of your body, anywhere from your collarbones to your kneecaps, and the back side of your body, are the muscles that are responsible for stabilizing your trunk. Basically everything that has a role when it comes to protecting the central nervous system and that stack of vertebrae that we call your spine. Direct core training is very effective, and as most of us are not having all day active jobs, we need to make sure that we're effective and efficient at connecting with those muscles so that they're there to keep the spine braced and safe. Direct core training also gives us the opportunity to vary the stimulus, meaning that we can do anti-movement, movement, or rotational and anti-rotational components with a focus on these muscles that are built to keep us safe. Finally, number 6, the everything else movement of the Turkish get-up. Many people don't know this one by name, and if they do, they might have forgotten what it's called. Here's a video of it. The Turkish get-up as a gym exercise is an example of using your entire body in a functional chain, meaning that you're using your ankle, your knee, your hip, your low back, your mid back, all the way up to your neck and your arm and shoulder as you hold the weight overhead. We're using all of those together, and we're using them in a pattern, a very specific sequence of movements. In the gym, it might look a little weird and awkward, but it's the same series of movements that your grandma is going to use to stand up off of the floor if she falls down on her own, and it's how an elite warfighter is going to get up off of his back while he has 100 pounds of gear and a weapon. This shows us that it's a fundamental human movement pattern. It's how we're supposed to get off the ground without exposing our body to undue stress. And it's a great complement to the other movement patterns that we've talked about, because this is the everything else. This is where we get into the corners and the positions that are kind of in between our excellent squat, hinge, pushing, and pulling. You will feel a lot of core work in the Turkish get-up as well. And there are ways to modify for sticky shoulders or cranky knees so you can still get the benefits of this exercise without hurting yourself. Okay, let's get into things a little bit more detailed now. Starting with the squat. This is always going to have a wider foot position than our other movements. This is because we need to get our legs far enough apart that our hips can drop down in between the feet. Now, when we're doing loaded training, whether it's your body weight or external load, we have a couple of parameters that we use to keep the squat safe. But you will see that individuals who are accustomed to this position will be able to achieve a very low squat. Sometimes this is called the third world chair, because it's the position that you'll see people adopt when they just need to get down to the ground and they live in a society where chairs are not as frequent and rampant as they are for us. The third world chair, going all the way down into that low squat, shows that we have optimal movement through the ankle, the knee, and the hip, and the low back. If you are limited in any one of those joints or joint segments, you'll feel an inability or a real challenge to get into that low squat. Because of that, the low squat can actually be therapeutic in itself, but again, it's not something that we'd want to do with external load, with extra weight in our hands. It's exposing to those joints, and it's something that we want to build up over time if it's a capacity that we've lost. Now, number 2, for the hinge. The hinge means that we're really utilizing the utmost power of the core to brace the spine in a nice strong position, and then use the hamstrings and the glutes and the muscles of the quad to really straighten the body out and to come up to a standing position to pick something up off the ground. The hinge is probably your most powerful movement pattern of all. Not only is it how people deadlift tremendous amounts of weight, it's also how we produce explosive movement like a run, the first step of a sprinter, or a powerful jump. The hinge pattern will have the feet more narrow, the kneecaps right above the ankles, and the hip bones right above the kneecaps. This is because we're trying to produce ultimate force vertically. When you're in the hinge position, it's very important that your spine is nice and flat and safe, not overextended, not folded forward or flexed, and you're able to maintain that position when we add the load. Now, you'll always be able to maintain a better position if you take that position before you add the load. It's impossible to get into a good position once you're already loaded. For example, if you get your back nice and organized, you can pick up a tremendous amount of weight. But if you start in a bad position, you start to pick up that weight, it's going to be impossible or very challenging to achieve a good position. And I would argue that if you enter into a loaded position, you'll never be able to get into as good a position as you would be able to if you went there unloaded first. So you can always maintain more than you can attain. When it comes to pushing and pulling, I like to prioritize horizontal work before vertical work. Now, there are some specialty athletes and some activities that require that vertical work, and if that's you, make sure you don't skip it. But I will say that horizontal pressing and horizontal pulling is a little easier on the shoulder, which is frequently important in today's society. If we were all optimal humans that had never been at a computer for hours and hours, days and decades, maybe we'd be able to do all of these equally perfectly. But because we know what constraints we deal with as a 21st century person, we want to make sure that we factor that into our fitness program. So if you need to, if you have cranky shoulders, work on your horizontal pressing and your horizontal pulling before you start to do too much vertical. Now, the vertical are also useful, and it's not just the shoulders that they train, it's also the low back, the abs, and the muscles all the way down to your feet. But they are more demanding to have optimal mobility so you can achieve a position where your hand is directly above your shoulder. Most people do this and their arm will stop right about here. They feel a tension or a tightness, and suddenly they'll start to tip their rib cage backwards in order to achieve verticality with their arm. That's not an appropriate compensation because it just shifts the load from the shoulder to the low back, and that's a recipe for disaster. Horizontal pushing, horizontal pulling, that allows us to work around a shoulder while we're trying to improve it. Now, for direct core training, there's one thing that you need to know, more important than anything else. The muscles that make up your core, and that's everything from your collarbones to your kneecaps, front and back of your body. Those are predominantly type 1 muscle fibers, and that means that they're built for a long, steady contraction. They're postural, so this makes sense. They're built to work for us throughout the entirety of the day, holding us up and allowing us to do what we need to do. Because we know what type of muscle fibers they are predominantly made of and what those fibers are built for, we want to make sure that our core training lines up with our physiology. So I often see people in the gym and they're doing rapid core exercise, quickly doing sit-ups or moving their legs back and forth in a leg lift. Unfortunately, while this feels like a really good workout, it's not lining up their physiology with their training style. What we like to see, at least as a first step, is to focus on the tension of your core, particularly here, the abs and low back and the glutes. focusing on those in a fashion of what we call isometric contraction. And that means that there's tension in the muscle, but there's no change in length. An easy way to think about isometric contraction is with your grip. If you grab something and you squeeze as tight as you can, these muscles will be tight, but there's no change in length the way the bicep gets shorter as you do a bicep curl or a pull-up. So an isometric contraction means that there's tension without any movement. That's actually exactly what we want when it comes to stabilizing the spine. Tension without movement is how we create bracing. It means that in the front of your body, from the waistband of your shorts to the bottom of your rib cage, this distance doesn't change at all. Whether you're running, jumping, moving, this stays stable because of isometric tension. So taking that idea to your direct core training means that we're going to lean heaviest and initially on movements or lack of movements like the plank, the side plank, the hollow body, the glute bridge, things where we have that isometric tension, we're stabilizing the trunk, and there's no movement happening. Now, this isn't a very exciting way to train core. You're never going to make the cover of a magazine doing something like a hollow body hold, but it is lining up your physiology with your training style. And I always advocate for people to start with anti-movement core training before they do movement core training. Anti-movement, like we talked about, planks, side plank, tension without any change in length. Movement core is what we see most of the time. That's your crunches, your leg lifts, your reverse sit-ups. It's all those things where there's a shortening in the abs, which is effective. It trains them, and you'll feel the fatigue and the soreness, but it's not their first duty. They're not doing the isometric contraction that we want. So keep this in mind. As you're going through a training program, we want to squat, we want to hinge, we want to push and pull horizontally and vertically if we can, and then we want to make sure we get that direct core training. There's a simple formula for you here. If you increase the amount of direct core training that you do, you will get more results from the pushing, pulling, hinging, and squatting. It's like an amplifier or a magnifier. With no direct core training, you can only get so good at those other 4 movement patterns. But if you lean into that direct core training, if you do the anti-movement, you'll see that it manifests itself while you're squatting, hinging, pushing, and pulling. You'll be able to do more repetitions, more load, or more work in less time because you're working at a higher efficiency. Finally, you'll also be safer while you perform that work. So direct core training, if not the most important thing, it's definitely one of the most important and should not be eliminated from any workout program. Now, finally, let's talk about the Turkish get-up. The Turkish get-up is a fantastic everything else movement because it gets out of the linear and very straight positions of the squat, hinge, pushing, and pulling, and allows us to do some rotation, some single work stuff, unilateral patterns, meaning a crisscross in the body, and do that in a very functional human movement pattern. Actually, a way that you probably learned to get up off the ground when you were a little kid without even knowing that you were learning such an important movement. The Turkish get-up can be modified a lot, and I always advocate that it should be done in stages, matching your current ability, and then only working up a little bit at a time. I tell people that it's not like all the results come rushing in when you finish the last step. There's benefit at all steps along the way as you progress through the movement. And if you rush to the top, you can actually overwhelm some parts of your body while not fully developing other parts. Basically, you'll be limited by your weakest link. We want to make sure that as you go through, you have no weakest link and you build all those links progressively. The Turkish get-up may get you some attention while you're in the gym, but it's definitely one that you should include. Now, if you need to modify it, there's a couple of things you can do. The first way to modify is to just shorten the range of motion. Most commonly, I advocate for people to do a half Turkish get-up. That's just coming up to your elbow and then onto your hand, holding the weight overhead or at your shoulder. This way you've worked on the rotation, you've created that half sit-up, you've built yourself up through the arm, shoulder, and support on the ground, and you have pushing in 2 opposite directions at the same time. When you're doing your Turkish get-ups, you can work first the half get-up and then start to lift your hips and transition your leg through. and finally get to that last portion where you get into a lunge and you straighten up to standing. Remember, when you get there, you're only halfway done. You'll need to walk your way all the way back down and end up where you started, flat on your back. Maintain control on the way down because we don't want to lose our position due to momentum. So don't let your body pick up any speed on the way down. All right, I hope that this was useful for you and that you learned a thing or two about what a thorough workout program should include. As a reminder, we have the squat, the hinge, pushing and pulling, the direct core, and then finally the Turkish get up. Now, that doesn't mean that other movements are unvaluable. It just means that these are our priorities and we should make sure that we at least have these covered before we add a lot of additional stuff. Finally, if you are engaged in a workout program that does not already include these 6 patterns, you will have results waiting for you when you include all 6. So go out there, do a little bit of training to patch up your program, make sure you have all of these included, and that you'll get the results and the safety that these entail. All right, thanks for joining us. Hopefully this has been an informational presentation for you. And remember, don't hesitate to send me any questions you may have because my role is to help you. So anything that I can do to support that is what I want to hear about. Send me a message, drop me a question, look me up, and I'll be here to help you. All right, thanks for watching.